Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. On this week's episode of GardenDC, we're joined by Kim Eierman. She's the founder of EcoBeneficial LLC, and her book is The Pollinator Victory Garden, Winning the War on Pollinator Decline with Ecological Gardening. Welcome, Kim.
Oh, thanks so much, Kathy. Glad to be here.
Good to have you on this wintry week here in the Mid-Atlantic. And we're due in for more snow. How about you?
Yep, we're going to get, it sounds like about 6 to 10 inches. And that's so great for the garden. So I'm not displeased about that at all.
Yeah, a nice fluffy layer on top of everything else. And can you describe exactly where you're calling in from?
Yes, I am in Westchester County, New York, which is just north of the Manhattan. And so I tell folks I am 16 miles north of Grand Central Station. I'm in a congested suburban area. And so if I can have a pollinator victory garden in my landscape, so can you.
Yeah, that's a great example. And for many of us in urban areas where 16 miles actually turns out to be an hour and a half commute, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Not 16 minutes. It's even more important to have those pollinator habitats squeezed in there. And the reason we're talking to you this week on GardenDC is because you are one of the featured speakers at the Greenscapes Symposium, hosted by Brookside Gardens, that took place on Friday, February 19th. And you are joined on the speaker roster by Doug Tallamy, Claudio Vasquez of Isel Plants, Emily McCoy, landscape architect. Looks like, such a great program, and you got to talk about the pollinator part.
Yes, and following Doug Tallamy, and that is no small task.
Yes, I was going to say that's the most intimidating time slot of the day, I'm sure.
But at least they were awake.
Yeah, and then they're so receptive at that point after Doug has primed them up. Then you get to kind of hit it out of the park with your section. Are you often on conference slates with Doug?
Occasionally, of course, this past year, we had a few that were canceled. So it's a moving target. But, I speak at a lot of conferences. I do a lot of teaching. I teach at New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and the Native Plant Center, and Rutgers Home Garden School. But I do a lot of speaking to small groups, medium-sized groups, huge groups, both to new gardens, seasoned gardens, and professionals.
And I saw that you also speak at Mount Cuba.
Yeah, occasionally I do. It's, the pandemic is a strange thing because now I'm speaking a lot of places that I didn't used to be able to get to easily. And so I just spoke at the International Society of Arboriculture, their annual conference that would have been in Arizona. And I have to tell you, I kind of miss going to Arizona. With this wonderful world of virtual speaking and teaching, just getting much more of an outreach, which is really fun.
And with the snowstorm coming,
Oh,
it kind of relieves you of the yeah, exactly.
Not going anywhere.
Exactly. So that would have been tough coming back from Arizona and then speaking here at Brookside Gardens and Silver Spring, Maryland. So that kind of is a silver lining in there. But you do miss the in-person part. And I was going to ask you to compare some of the audiences. So Greenscapes audiences includes professionals and home gardeners, but then at other conferences you might just be addressing home gardeners and or one might be all professionals. Do you change up, and how do you change for those audiences?
It is tricky, I must say. And the pandemic and our virtual speaking has made this even more complicated because you kind of have to assume that you may have a lot of different levels of knowledge in an audience. So, for example, speaking to arborists, you have no clue at an annual conference with thousands of people attending how many know a darn thing about pollinators or native plants or anything. So I just try to take a medium approach, and my general approach is to be, fairly anecdotal and informative. And since I do a lot of teaching, that's the way that I usually approach it. And I just assume that somebody's going to get something out of this presentation, no matter what, no matter what your level. Hopefully, I've given you something that's going to be useful.
Yeah, that's very true. And that even professionals don't know everything. You can't assume.
No, I cannot tell you how many times I've been hired by an organization like a botanical society, et cetera, and they'll tell me, our members know so much. They're really experienced. They're really knowledgeable. So, you got to really be high level with them. And invariably, it's not quite that. I must say, invariably. So, yeah, there are a lot of really smart people gardening. But I think we tend to have our little niches where we may be expert. Like if you ask me to talk about vegetable gardening, it would be a very dull interview. That is something I don't know about, but we all have our little niches that we're quite expert in, I guess. And so can always learn. I always learn. I learn. I think the world of Zoom is wonderful because I'm able also to participate and listen to some interesting speakers that I might not be able to hear otherwise too.
And then there's the other interactive features like being able to post a poll or
Hmm.
ask people in the
Yeah.
chat where in person you could ask people to raise their hand and say,
Hmm.
how many people currently have a pollinator garden? And then
Right.
get that
Right.
gauge. Yeah.
I do miss the personal interaction, but we're very fortunate that we have this as an option.
So, how did you start on the journey, Kim? Were you born just with chlorophyll in your veins and jumped up and planted a row of pansies, or how did it happen?
So I grew up in Maryland, in fact, in Timonium, Maryland, home of the state fair, not far from DC. And my mother's gardening was not that great. My mother would grow basil in a pot. She'd grow maybe an occasional tomato in a planter, tomato plant. She had a couple peonies and this hard plant that she was always battling. I think she spent more time pruning this back than doing anything else in the garden. That was pyracantha. I hated that plant. And so I had absolutely zero influence from my family relative to gardening. But I was a nature freak from the time I was a little kid. I just loved nature. And so as a teenager, I was the one that was going to Outward Bound and going to National Outdoor Leadership School and just immersing myself in it. And so I'm also kind of a city girl, right? So when I graduated from college, I moved to New York City and spent quite a while there. So I've got uh, I've got a couple different personalities going on, so to speak, things that interest me. But living in the city was frustrating because the only time I could have any contact with nature is when I got out of the city. And so we moved to Westchester County many years ago and got my little piece of suburban, uh, you know, uh, wonder here with things that grow in the ground. And I started to take classes at the New York Botanical Garden, which was only 7 miles away. And that connection that I had with nature then kind of translated into my passion for landscaping. So that's how it happened.
And then what made you aware first about the pollinator decline? Like, what was your first encounter with that?
Well, I think like most of us, it really started with the collapse of honeybee populations, right? Because I don't think most of us really had heard very much about insect decline before that. Now, there certainly was research going on in Europe and some other areas of the world, but primarily in Europe. But the crashing populations of honeybees, which of course are not native to North America, but have been here for 400 years. They were brought in 1622 to Jamestown, Virginia, along with things like peacocks and bull mastiffs and lots of European weeds. And they've been here a while, and they were kind of the focus, excuse me, of agricultural extensions in terms of providing information and support on honeybee management, because they're very good generalist pollinators. And so when those populations started to crash, I started paying a lot of attention to that, and wondered, well, what's happening with our own native pollinators? And one piece of information led to another, and realized that there was a real lack of robust information about the crashing of, for example, native bee populations. That a lot of the studies were quite old and not very robust, and that's changed. That's changed dramatically. But then you start thinking, well, when I was a kid, I remember going out on a warm summer night, a humid evening, and you'd go out for a drive with your folks, and you'd have insects splatter all over your windscreen in your car, right? That doesn't happen the way that it used to. It just doesn't happen anymore. So something is going on. It's beyond pollinator loss. It's about insect decline. And then if you think about it, it's not only insects. It's vertebrates and invertebrates, bird decline, and so on and so on. Species loss is absolutely extraordinary, both with vertebrate and invertebrate species. And anybody that's listening, I really invite you to look at the website of the IUCN and take a look and see that scary data. You'll start thinking a little bit differently about what you can do in your landscape and how important it is when you realize how many species are at risk.
And that's IUCN. What does
Mhm.
that stand for?
International Union of, let's see, International Conservation. I think that's it. I always call it IUCN. No, I'm going to have to look it up.
Okay.
uh, International International Union for Conservation of Nature,
Ah, okay.
IUCN.org. So they're kind of like they're the gold standard for measuring species loss. And even they will admit that they don't monitor every species. They only monitor a small fraction because there's so many species on Earth.
Yeah, I don't know how you would be able to
Yeah.
count everything since there's still species being discovered all around us.
Yes.
So, previously on the podcast, we've talked about home beekeeping, obviously the honeybees, the non native ones that we talked about, and butterfly gardening from the Smithsonian Gardens. And we focus particularly on monarch habitats. But you have a much broader emphasis on pollinators. Can you talk about some of those other categories?
Sure. So, animal pollinators are the ones that we think of when we think about pollination services. Obviously, a lot of plants are wind pollinated. Some plants are water pollinated, i.e., the seed is dispensed uh, via water. But our animal pollinators include the obvious, like bees, but there are others, that maybe we don't think about all the time in our landscape. So there are beetles that are pollinators. They primarily are pollen eaters. They also, a lot of them like to eat flower parts. And of course, we have butterflies, which we've thought of as perhaps inefficient pollinators, but I'm going to make a comment about that in a minute. And even moths can be very good pollinators. Some moths don't eat as adults, like our silk moths don't eat anything when they're adults, which is kind of fascinating, but many moths do. We have some species of flies that are pollinators. And we've got, even in the Southwest and limited part of California, pollinating bats. So not all of the species within a particular group are pollinators, but many are. And it's a wild world out there. In some places in the world, even marsupials can be pollinators. It's kind of funny, but primarily, in our own landscapes, we're thinking about insects, and then of course birds. And we think of hummingbirds primarily, but there are over 50 species of birds in North America that feed on nectar. So there are quite a few that we can support in our landscapes. So let me just make a comment about butterflies, right? Because I heard that wonderful interview about the butterfly gardening. It was really great. And, we've kind of dismissed butterflies historically as not very important pollinators and not very effective pollinators. And as a person who's focused on the environment and using native plants to improve the environment, I'm always thinking about evolutionary connections and what we might not know that we just haven't learned yet by observing Mother Nature. So just I think it's less than 5 years ago, there was a study that came out of North Carolina State, observing swallowtail butterflies and their nectaring on a plant, Flamizelia rhododendron calendulaceum. And they found in this study that swallowtail butterflies nectared, they foraged a little bit differently than other butterflies. What they do is they flap their wings, swallowtail butterflies, while they're nectaring, and that's called wing pollination. And while they're feeding and they're flapping their wings, they're releasing pollen, which gets on their wings, and they go on to the next flower and on to the next plant. Turns out that they're the most efficient pollinators of that particular plant, Rhododendron calendulaceum flamizelia. So I was very humbled by that information, and it makes me think that there's so many other of these evolutionary connections we just don't know about yet. So we can never take a pollinator for granted, because it might be doing a very important job.
So true. And so the name of your book, The Pollinator Victory Garden. So when we hear the term victory garden, we think of something very specific, World War One
Yes.
or two, vegetable garden. So how did you come up with the name, and what is a pollinator victory garden?
So, I came up with this concept quite a few years ago, pre-pandemic. So I guess I was kind of lucky in terms of the timing of the book. But in World War One and World War Two, I think there were over 20 million American households that created gardens for food defense. Essentially as a way to help the war. It was kind of a marketing effort, really, as I understand it. I don't think it was the difference between people starving and not, but it's a way to get people involved, participate in the war effort, do what they could if they couldn't go to war and fight themselves. And so I thought that was, a really pretty significant movement. I thought, well, we need that for pollinators. We need to have a similar movement for pollinators where it's top of mind for all of us in terms of what we can do, and each of us can participate. And so, a pollinator victory garden is really a garden that has certain attributes that make it a best practice approach, right? So, first of all, when we think of pollinators, we think of flowers, and we don't always think about where pollinators live. We think about what they eat. So, habitat, including the appropriate habitat for different species of pollinators, is absolutely essential to helping them survive, not just survive, but to thrive. So, in the case of our native bees, the vast majority of our native bees are ground nesters. So, thinking about including areas in your landscape that are not covered up with mulch or plants, preferably bare areas in full sun with workable, friable soil, is a really great place to accommodate and support ground nesting pollinators. So, sometimes it can be a challenge to kind of fabricate that. Ground nesting bees may not think that you've chosen the right spot. So, really, a good way to do this is to observe and see where ground nesting bees are already going, and make that hallowed ground, make that an area where you are not landscaping, you're not trampling through, etc. And then the other percentage, a smaller percentage of our native bees are cavity nesters, and we can help them find the habitat they need in a number of different ways. So, for example, keeping some pithy stem plants standing, hollow stem plants, and maybe cutting off a few of those old Joe Pye weeds in the early fall, and maybe some elderberries to create some overwintering habitat for a cavity nesting bee. Most of those bees are going to die, of course, before winter sets in, but some will be overwintering and surviving. And thinking about other areas where these cavity nesters might be using that exist in our landscapes. For example, you might have a stone wall where you've got some stones missing, and there are some cavities in that stone wall. Perfect place for perhaps some bumblebees, or old mouse holes or beetle burrows, where bees, cavity nesting bees, might also use. Keeping some dead trees or dying trees standing. That sounds like a big ask in small landscapes. I understand that. But if you've got a tree where there's no target, there's no hazard target, okay, you're good to go. But if you are concerned about a tree coming down, we'll cut it down to a manageable height and let it die, because the beetles will tunnel through it, and then those beetle tunnels will be used by bees. So creating habitat, promoting habitat, encouraging habitat is just as important in a pollinator victory garden as providing floral resources. So that's the first, one of the first best practices.
And what would your secondary best practice be?
Okay. Oh, where to go with native plants? Okay. If I haven't given myself away yet, I'm a native plant lady, right? So it's with a reason, and trust me, I love plants. I'm a plantaholic. I have a blog post on my website called My Brugmansia. A native plant geek goes AWOL. Yeah, I love plants, but I do appreciate the fact that with development, which has been so dramatic over the past 100 years, we've lost so much natural habitat where creatures can live, where we can support wildlife and support our native plants. And so the Doug Tallamy message, our homes can be refugia, right? They can be our landscapes can be places where these creatures, if they fly, they've got a really good chance of getting here and moving into other areas where they can be supported as well. But we can really do quite a bit in our home landscapes. And so those evolutionary connections, I've alluded to with the butterfly example, aren't always obvious. And we are really in good shape if we use Mother Nature's cues, right? So pollinators, about 25% of our native bee species, are specialists on particular plant pollen. And so if we know that, then we can start to include some of those specialist plants. And a couple of those I'll mention, and I can't wait for spring. Some of our spring ephemerals, plants that emerge before trees leaf out when there's enough moisture and enough sun, and then they die back in the summer. And they're wonderful additions to a woodland or shady garden. So things like Claytonia virginica, right? Little tiny spring ephemeral, charming as can be, easy to tuck into a woodland or shade garden. So that plant has an association with a particular mining bee, which is a specialist on that plant. Geranium maculatum, or wild geranium, there's another one that's also a specialist plant. And even sometimes, even if there's not this very strict evolutionary connection between plant and pollinator, pollinators have preferences about plants. So if we think, okay, maybe Mother Nature does know best, and maybe if I use native plants that are appropriate to my site and native to my region, then I'm going to actually be supporting more of the ecosystem that I want to support. And so native plants, that would be my second tip. Really, doesn't have to be 100%. I'd love it if it was, but you can have your indulgences in the landscape. I just received a packet of these fabulous looking poppies from Renee's Garden Seeds. I bet you got those too, Catherine.
Those are
And I'm like,
amazing. Yep.
where can I put those? They're gonna go in a container, on my patio, and I'll have my little non-native indulgence, But they're fabulous. Who doesn't want those? So, but native plants are quite important for those evolutionary connections that I mentioned. And thinking about biodiversity as a gardener or a landscape professional is key, especially in the face of climate change. And so thinking about, in a pollinator garden, what I call achieving floral balance, achieving a balance between diversity, plant diversity, and plant sufficiency. So we're having a diverse array of plants in our landscapes, but we're having enough of any given species. So let me kind of explain that. Diversity really matters because we've got a lot of different pollinators. Like I mentioned, we've got the bees, we've got the beetles, we've got the pollinating flies. Even wasps can be good pollinators. They're not as good as bees because they're not fuzzy like bees are, but hummingbirds and so on and so on. So each group has its preferences in terms of suites of plant characteristics. So you probably noticed in your own garden, if you've got wonderful red flowers that are filled with nectar, like a Monarda didyma, a bee balm, or a Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower, or Silene virginica, that wonderful little red plant. You'll notice the hummingbirds will find those. They'll come into your landscape and they'll scout, and they're looking for red because that's their favorite. Now, if they can't find it, yeah, they'll go to a penstemon. They'll find another source, but they prefer those red tubular flowers. And so those kinds of preferences and a lot of these are just evolutionary developments exist between plants and pollinators. So we got to have a diverse array of plants to accommodate different types of pollinators. So that's where the diversity comes in. The sufficiency part of floral balance. Well, what's that about? So it kind of makes sense, even if you didn't know there was research there. But research out of the University of California, Berkeley Bee Lab found that a 1 square meter mass of the same species was an ideal target for a pollinator to find. That tells us, making targets in our landscape is not a bad idea, right? This is going to help pollinators find the resource. This can be tricky for those of us that don't have big landscapes. It's a lot to ask to have a diverse array of flowering plants and, of course, host plants too, as well as sufficient targets. So I think we compromise on this and we do the best we can. What we don't do is in the spring, we don't go to that native plant sale and buy one perennial at some little itty bitty thing and tuck in the garden and hope that a pollinator is going to find it. We create smaller targets. We buy 3 or we buy 5. We create a large enough grouping so a pollinator's got a fighting chance to find it. Or we can think about creating a meadowscape, a meadow-like garden in our landscapes. And this is a very effective tool in deer country. And who doesn't live there? There's so much deer browse in this country.
Hmm.
It's a little scary. So a meadowscape it can be a very erratic array of flowering plants and grasses as you would find in a naturally occurring meadow, or it can be more designed. But if you choose the more erratic pattern of plants, it becomes less of a deer buffet, right? They don't have this easy target. But the cool thing is that pollinators like bees and butterflies have a behavior called floral constancy. And when they go out on each of their foraging missions during the course of a day, they're looking for one species of plant. And so if your meadowscape, say in the spring, is got probably one of the earlier blooming plants in a meadow, penstemon, it might be a penstemon digitalis, common beard tongue, or it might be penstemon hirsutus, hairy penstemon. I love all the penstemons. They're wonderful plants. That pollinator's going to be able to kind of find that repetition of bloom in that meadow and be able to utilize that resource. So there are a couple of different ways to do that. So I've lost my train of thought.
Well,
I got going. I can tell you the whole book.
yes. So that was a lot of great information there, especially that square meter clump
Yeah,
or having a larger landscape but repeated use
yeah,
of the same plant throughout it. So
right.
I think that's, probably the toughest part for
Yeah.
personally for me as a plant collector who has onesie twosie
Oh,
plants
yeah,
everywhere,
yeah,
to learn that lesson that yeah, for actual pollinator attraction, you want to have a good sized stand of something, or if you're in containers, or you're dealing with, say, with a HOA who wants you to
right.
have all green turf on the front, that you'll have to kind of garden on the edges and find some other ways around that.
And that brings me to another point. There is another way that's a hack, right? Is get to know your neighbors and make buddies with them and convince them that they need some native plants to support pollinators too. So it took me 26 years living next to one neighbor to get to this place. But she now has this wonderful pollinator garden that was installed on Memorial Day this past year. And she is thrilled with what is going on in there. So, of course, what I've just done, is increase the resources for the pollinators that are visiting my landscape, and I'm sharing the wealth. So now she gets the wonderful butterflies and the bees and the pollinating flies and the hummingbirds, and she couldn't be happier. So this speaks to defragmenting habitat. This speaks to creating more connectivity from one landscape to another. Now, I don't think it's gotten quite as far down out as Washington, D.C. yet, but we have an initiative that started a few years ago in Wilton, Connecticut called the Pollinator Pathway Project. And this is just, it's a volunteer run project, a great website, Pollinator, I think it's pollinator-pathway.org. Lots of good resources there. And I'll give a plug for the resources on my website too, EcoBeneficial.com. I got a whole section on the Pollinator Victory Garden. So look at those two and you'll learn a lot about, how you can create your own thriving pollinator garden, but also start to defragment habitat and increase resources for pollinators by getting other neighbors involved, getting towns involved, using vacant lots, using church landscapes, using school landscapes, and so on and so on. That's where we are going to make a difference. It takes a village. Remember that saying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what we can do. And it's not just going to be pollinators, P.S. So there is no such thing as a pollinator victory garden that doesn't support other species, because you're going to get other species that benefit from this approach too. But defragmenting habitat and getting neighbors excited, I really enjoy this. I mean, to the credit of several of my clients, that I've built gardens for, they've had me come in and do walk and talks. And we've even had like a plant party with neighbors pre-pandemic, where I'll come in, do a little lecture, and we get some native plugs to hand out for free to the people that show up. These are friends and family members and whatnot of my clients. And then we walk through the garden. We talk about the plants and what they do and what they attract. And everybody goes home with a few plants that they can plant themselves. So, I know this is a tall order with a pandemic, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we'll get past that. We'll get past that. So do the kind of sharing that you can do online, and get other people excited. And it's such a fulfilling thing when you've planted a plant and all of a sudden you're seeing creatures that are using that plant that you never saw before. It's totally astounding. And one of my great pleasures in life, getting photos from my clients. They're sending me photos of what they're seeing in their garden. It's great. It's great.
Yeah, it's wonderful advice, and I love the idea of sprinkling the same kind of plant down the block.
Mhm.
And sometimes it just happens organically, like
Yes.
literally reseeds itself.
Right.
My penstemon makes it, or a
Right.
squirrel digs up a bulb and moves it down the block. And then there's, the more deliberate where somebody comes along and says, "Oh, I love that iris." And then you
Yeah.
dig a section and share it with them. And I often see, several blocks where I'm like, well, that definitely migrated from one garden to the other by hand. I could see that. And then I was going to say, I love the idea of like you might have a shared driveway or a
Oh
shared
yeah.
hill strip or median
Yep.
strip, and to
Yep.
make that your pollinator victory garden between you and your neighbor. And that's often, of course, where the full sun is.
Right. And I mean, it's a nice way to connect with your neighbors, it's a meaningful connection. I mean, it may sound kind of silly, but it really is a meaningful connection because you're sharing something that's joyful with them. And God, do we need that now?
And who
A
doesn't
lot
love free
more.
plants?
Yeah, yeah. And so, a lot of folks are a little wary of straight species natives, certain ones that are prolific reseeders. Not all are prolific reseeders, but it's such a minor inconvenience. But what I suggest is you dig those little babies up, the little volunteers that you didn't plan on or didn't want, and just put them in, small pots and share them with friends, with family, with the local school, with whoever's got a garden, and people really enjoy that.
One of the ways you can share, of course, is if you're in a garden club, host a
Mhm.
little plant swap, or what I've been doing because of the pandemic, and you want to have social distancing, of course, is just put some pots out at the end of my driveway with a free sign, and
Yes.
then you just post it to the neighborhood listserv
Yeah.
or next door or whatever, and say
Yep.
daylilies or whatever it is at the end of the driveway, and they disappear
They don't
fast.
last long.
No.
And in New York, you could put a sofa out and it won't last.
Yeah, and believe me, I've walked by other neighbors and scooped up, plants all along the way too, and come home with pockets full of dirt. So you're
Right.
like, "Oh yeah, I forgot I picked up these bulbs on the street." But yeah, that's a great way to pocket pollinator garden, and of course, when you're mentioning school gardens and church gardens, municipal gardens, you can lobby for less turf and
Oh yeah.
more meadow. And when you were talking about pollinator alley type gardens, we do have in the DC area a great proliferation of stream bed parkways that
Yep. Yep.
make the connection that way. And our Rock Creek Park through the city was one of the original ones doing that,
Yes.
so it
Yes.
created a nice avenue there. But of course, you can be more deliberate of if it's a built neighborhood and
Right.
creating something like that.
And so, I am not kind to the lawn. I call the lawn the green desert. It really is kind of an ecological wasteland. It's a cultural thing. We adopted this concept from Europe, but turf lawn. The vast majority of species are not going to be native. You might have a fescue in there or something that's native, but by and large, these are non-native species. And because we keep cutting them and we mow them and whatever, they're not very productive. They also don't have very deep roots, so they're not very good at holding stormwater either. So keep the lawn that you really use, lose the rest. That's my message. And so what do you do with that? I mean, how do you, and by the way, just letting weeds like clover and dandelions appear in your lawn, that does not make a meadow, right? That's better than a very sterile lawn, but that's really not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is doing something intentional, right? So I have this talk about this in the book, this concept of creating smaller pollinator islands in your lawn. So if your neighbors are concerned, you think you might have a problem with a homeowners association, whatever, if you dig up your whole lawn, start with an island, and create this wonderful little pollinator paradise in a patch that is aesthetically pleasing and does the job for pollinators. Think about the edges of your landscape, the borders between you and your neighbors. Think about your foundation plantings. There's no written rule that says a foundation planting has to have certain plants or has to be a certain width. Extend that out, create more depth, create those little ecotones, those areas of richness between taller plants and shorter plants, shrubs and herbaceous plants, for example. And just, starting to think about your woodland edge if you have one. That's usually a zone that's really abused. They're usually like tall trees, boop, transition to short grass. There's no kind of layering at all. And that's really not a good practice if we're trying to be ecologically supportive. We want to think about those layers from the canopy trees, the sub-canopy trees, the shrub layer, the herbaceous layer, etc. It's more aesthetically pleasing and it's more ecologically functional. So those are some of the things that you can do. Now, if you're in a neighborhood where everybody, is super neat and tidy, and you think a natural looking meadow might not fit the bill in your front yard, do it in the backyard. Be clever and plant in drifts. Doesn't have to be completely erratic meadow. And one of the easiest targets for conversion is a hillside. All right. Haven't you seen folks trying to mow their hillsides?
Oh yeah, I've seen people get out a rope literally.
Yeah, I mean, really. I mean, there's a better use for that that area. So think about a short meadow or meadowscape. Again, that will be much more ecologically supportive. And think about some plants that are deeply rooted and that will hold the soil, throughout 4 seasons. So you don't have an erosion problem. But I think we can lose a lot of turf and not miss much.
And speaking of plant selection, so you had mentioned penstemon as one of your favorites. What are some other great choices for the Mid-Atlantic gardener to start with?
All right. So the first thing I want to do is to share with you that I never like to suggest that people just look at like one plant list, right? So if you're going to be a good gardener, whether you're doing native gardening or not, you got to know some fundamentals, right? You've got to do a site analysis, even if it's a cursory site analysis, and make some estimation about the number of hours of full sun during the day, the moisture level, what your drainage is like. You've got to do a soil test. It gets me so upset when I see professionals that are not doing soil tests for clients. how can you possibly know that you can grow blueberries if you don't know what your soil pH is? Because a blueberry don't live in soil that's got a pH that's much higher than 5.5. So getting a good site analysis, and there's some wonderful resources, for that online, is the first step in trying to figure out what's going to grow. And then you've got to figure out, okay, what's native to my area and how native are you going to be? You could be thinking about plants that are native to the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic. You could be thinking about plants that are native to your state. You could be thinking about plants that are native to your county. So what's the best practice and the most limiting one? Get as close to where you are as possible in terms of nativity. But that can be tough because it really does limit plant choices. So I will tell you, I will freely admit that I use a mid-Atlantic plant in many landscapes. That is a really good one. Dicentra eximia, wild bleeding heart, that just seems to, flower off and on throughout the entire growing season from April through October. But I'm trying to emphasize plants that are regionally native to the county that I'm in, or at least the state I'm in, and that are appropriate for the site. So having given you that huge caveat, right? Do your research. Don't count on one list. Go online, look at resources like the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center database, right? The native plant database, lots of good information. You can do searches and filter those searches. Take a look at BONAP, BONAP.org, the Biota of North America program, and you can look up plant names and see if they're native to where you are. And why does that matter? Why does it matter that you're choosing a plant that's native to your general region? Well, here's an example. A wonderful plant in the Midwest is Silphium perfoliatum. I can't talk. Silphium perfoliatum, and that is cup plant. And it's a wonderful plant out in the Midwest, but it's an invasive plant on the list in both New York and Connecticut. So just because a plant is native to the United States doesn't mean it's appropriate for where you are. So, do a little digging. So, there are plants for shade and there are plants for sun. There are plants for dry soil. There are plants for wet soil. There are endless numbers of plants that I think are wonderful. If I'm in early spring in March and I'm wondering, oh my God, are the honeybees and some of our early bumblebees going to survive this year? And when I see red maple Acer rubrum in bloom, I'm happy. I'm happy because that's a great pollinator plant at that time of year. When I see Salix discolor, pussy willow, or any of our native willows that are in bloom early in the season, I'm happy because I know they're doing their job. When I'm thinking woodies now, wonderful plants like Cercis canadensis, our native red bud, but I know that, that's doing a great job. I'm a huge fan of the spring ephemerals for the reasons I explained. They're so important to many of our early emerging pollinators and particularly ones that are specialists. But they're plants that I use in many landscapes if the conditions are good, that I think are particularly great pollinator plants. Again, make sure they're appropriate to where you are. Anise hyssop, Agstachy funiculum, is a phenomenal pollinator plant.
Mm-hmm.
And it does matter, if you're choosing cultivars, which cultivar you choose. I would prefer that you buy straight species when you can find them. But not all cultivars function the same way in terms of the amount of nectar, the amount of resources, or the color being appropriate for the pollinator in question. That's a really good one. Our Monardas are just wonderful pollinator plants, but for different pollinators. So Monarda didyma, scarlet bee balm, that's going to be great for hummingbirds, whereas Monarda fistulosa, wild bergamot, is going to be fantastic for some of our bumblebees. And then Monarda punctata, which is known as spotted bee balm or horse mint, is a really funky looking, crazy pagoda arrangement of a bloom that attracts a lot of bees and a lot of wasps. Now, if you're a gardener, you
Mm-hmm.
know that wasps are good. You want them as predators, and in some cases with some species parasitizers. And they do deliver some pollination services too. So, but those three Monardas are going to grow in very different kind of situations. Your Monarda didyma is going to like full sun with plenty of moisture, or part sun again with plenty of moisture. I see that growing naturally in Western North Carolina, streamside in the shade. If you do that in most of our landscapes, you're going to get powdery mildew, but that's locally adapted, local genotype that's doing that there. And then Monarda bergamot, that's going to be, a plant that's going to be able to take a little bit drier soil, not crazy dry, right? But medium to on the slightly drier side, and is where it's going to perform best. And then Monarda punctata, well, that one wants great drainage, and it wants it actually really likes sandy soil, and it doesn't like a lot of fertility, and that'll do really well in that landscape. So, you know, it's tough to name just like one plant because they're all they're all so wonderful at what they do.
Hmm.
I am a particular fanatic for Joe Pye weeds. I love Joe Pye weeds, the Eutrochium species. They've been renamed from Eupatorium just to confuse us all. And they can be a challenge to use in a suburban landscape because they're so darn tall, 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet. Yike. So even though I try to use as much as I can with straight species plants, that's a time where I say, hey, better a dwarf Joe Pye weed than no Joe Pye weed at all. So I routinely will use little Joe or baby Joe in the landscape because just such a tremendous plant.
Yeah, that's a great point because a tall, floppy Joe Pye weed is probably not the best choice for an urban garden.
Yeah, it's
It's going
tricky.
to be
And
tough. Yeah.
there is a new cultivar called Ruby, which I'm just trialing. I just got some last season from a grower that's doing a lot of natives, and it's only supposed to be 32 inches tall. So we'll see. But see, the question is, how good of a plant is it in terms of ecological juice, right? Um, I have found out the hard way, as so many of us have, that some of these dwarf cultivars are just dogs. They're just dogs. They don't flower well. They don't produce much fruit. Some of the dwarf viburnums, for example, are not good plants. And so, that's a question to ask. And there are lots of there's lots of native washing going on now, guys. Let's be honest, right? Everybody is jumping on the native bandwagon. I was trying to pound the drum 20 years ago, and nobody was listening. And here we are. Everybody's jumping on the native bandwagon. But
Hmm.
use your brain cells and say, if this plant looks completely different than what I'm used to seeing, is it performing well? And maybe buy one and trial it and see. That's what I do for clients. Before I'm putting these things out in people's gardens, I'm trying them out and seeing if they're garden worthy and whether they have ecological function. So
Hmm.
here's an example. Boltonia asteroides, false aster, fabulous plant. Late summer bloom, likes moist soil, likes sun, beautiful plant. It's a little leggy. So there's a naturally occurring form, Nana, and so I picked some of those up, and it's only like, I don't know, a couple feet tall. Perfect. And I thought, okay, we'll see. Well, just loaded with pollinators. So for small landscapes or container gardening, and that's a topic that I speak about and I teach about, using native plants in containers. So that's just a great choice. So there are always exceptions. There are always compromises that we can make, and there are realities that we have to deal with in our landscapes.
Yeah, and there's also, of course, your own personal resources and what you can get. And we're so lucky in the DC area to be not too far away from Mount Cuba up the
Oh yeah.
road, which we
Yep.
mentioned earlier.
Yep.
And they've been doing some phenomenal native versus cultivar trials side
Right.
by side. So you can
Right.
go out there and look in person and also read their research online and
Yeah.
see, that Phlox Gina is a
Yeah.
cultivar that's actually outperforming the straight
Yes.
species, but,
Yes.
there's
Yes.
a place for all of it in your garden, so
Did,
it's great
did
to
you
know.
did you see that page in my book, Kathy?
Well,
So
and yes, and I visited Mount Cuba myself to check some of those out and take photos
so
because it's
yeah.
amazing.
So let me just talk about that a little bit. And so that's the conundrum. So for years, Mount Cuba was doing these plant trials. I've got an interview from years ago with Greg Tepper on some of their plant trials, and they were focused on garden worthiness for many many years until they got a hold of Doug Tallamy. Right. And so things have changed quite a bit over the years at Mount Cuba. But I remember Greg telling me, and he was a horticulturist at that time overseeing these trials, um, that I think it was their 2009 coneflower report, echinacea report. Most of those plants that they trialed were no longer for sale because they're such crappy plants, excuse my French. By the way, they've just come out with another coneflower report, which everybody should take a look at.
Mhm.
So things have changed, fortunately, and in that report, you'll see the pollinator activity on on the different cultivars. So here's the thing: one of the reasons that I am emphasizing straight species plants is for that genetic diversity that comes from that seed, particularly of local ecotypes being so important, right? But we've got the genetic diversity with straight species plants. The truth of the matter is the vast majority of cultivars, aka nativars, the vast majority of them are propagated asexually. Okay, they're tissue culture, they're cuttings, they're whatever they are, but they're clones. They're all genetically the same. So, let's think about that. Has that ever gotten us into trouble? Think Irish potato famine, perhaps, in terms of being reliant upon, one particular type of plant that is all the same. So I love Gina, and so I split the difference with clients. So I'll use some Gina because it attracts way more pollinators than virtually any phlox, including the straight species. But I also try to get the straight species in the garden, and I run the risk of hybridizing, and so distance can be helpful with that, kind of keeping them separate. But we need more native straight species plants if we're going to keep the earth going, and we need fewer cultivars. And that's tough because, when you go shopping for native plants, sometimes the only thing you can find are native cultivars. But if we ask and we talk to vendors and we make our requests known, we're going to have better choices. It's happening. It's happening now.
Yeah, and I think if you grow from seed that's collected, from another person's garden, that might be also another way. And there are also naturally occurring cultivars and selections as well.
Yes, there are, but typically that's not what you're going to find for
Hmm.
sale. You know,
Correct.
yeah.
This has been so educational and inspiring. We have to get out and get some springtime so we can plant some of these natives and get that snow to melt off our spring ephemerals, which will be coming up in a few weeks. Can you tell our listeners again how they can contact you and get more information on your book as well?
Sure. So I invite you to visit my website, which is ecobeneficial.com, just as it sounds, and just loaded with information, including lots of information on the Pollinator Victory Garden. Feel free to contact me on my contact form there. I love getting questions from folks. Appreciate that. And as far as the book is concerned, you can buy it anywhere. Books are sold, as they say. But here's my request to you. I would love it. I would love it if you buy two copies, okay? Buy one on Amazon, fine, but go ahead and find your independent bookseller who's really struggling right now. Okay, had a really, really rough year, and make sure you put in an order with them too, because they need our support.
Thank you again, Kim. And I am going to be planting even more penstemon than I have currently so I can make that meter size area, that solid area, because I feel like I have a lot of penstemon, but not quite to that size.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. Really appreciate you having me today.
Plant profile: Winter Jasmine. Winter jasmine, Jasminum nudiflorum, blooms in mid to late winter in the mid-Atlantic region. You will see them flowering in front yards, cascading over retaining walls and down the sides of steps. My favorite use of them is in the concrete containers that line the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The plant itself is classified as a deciduous perennial, though most consider it a shrub, and it can be trained as a vine as well. The weeping habit of winter jasmine is really quite lovely. Try a winter jasmine trained on an arbor or trellis. It also makes a good ground cover, especially on a slope or hillside. If planted in the ground, it can sucker and spread, but it is easily pulled up and potted up to share. It thrives in a variety of growing situations, from full to part sun, from wet to dry soils. I have never had to water mine, even in the hottest of summers. They are pollution tolerant and are generally not troubled by pests. It is often mistaken for forsythia, but there are several differences. The winter jasmine stems are squarish, flexible, and deep green, while the forsythia stems are round, brittle, and brown. Also, the winter jasmine blooms are a lighter yellow and a little smaller than forsythia. Finally, forsythia's normal bloom time is later, in mid-March here in our area. Winter jasmine is one of those carefree background plants that shines in the worst of the gray winter season. It deserves a spot in your garden. Support the garden media before it's gone. What happened to the G in HGTV? Where did all the garden stories in my local newspaper disappear to? How did the garden section of my local bookstore shrink to just half a shelf? You know that your daily newspapers and local community weeklies are shrinking, but have you ever pondered why one section in particular, sports, never seems to shrink? It's not because it has the most advertising support, nor does it have the broadest appeal. What it does have is a rabid readership base. And when I say rabid, I mean that not only do readers follow every story, both online and in the paper, but they engage with that content. They post comments and go back and read what others write, then comment again. They tweet out links and pass them along on Facebook. They are voracious for any tiny little scrap of new information about their favorite teams and player. Why doesn't gardening have that same kind of enthusiastic fan base? Well, actually it does. Gardening is by far the most popular pastime in the USA, and we added another 16 or so million gardeners just last year. Alas, though, it's also a primarily solitary pursuit, with each of us in our own garden puttering and weeding in our own little world. Some join garden clubs or volunteer at local public gardens, sure, but the vast majority do not. They may read the garden column in their local daily and nod in agreement or chuckle in amusement, but rarely does it move them to action. Even the touchy subjects of deer and native plants barely get a rise out of even the most passionate home gardener. Sure, we complain to ourselves when the daily paper cuts the home and garden section to one thin column, or when our local PBS station cancels our favorite garden show, but do we know that we are actually causing the demise of these worthy garden communication vehicles by our inaction? What you can do. First, subscribe to both print and online gardening publications, and to other publications that contain garden-related content. Give gift subscriptions to everyone you know who may or shown a dot of gardening passion within them. Write letters to the editor, letting them know you read the garden content and would like to see more of it. Be specific and effusive. Thank the advertisers that do support garden publications and let them know you appreciate their investment by purchasing their products and services. When you share a garden story via email or social media, never copy more than the headline and the first sentence or two, along with a link back to where it is originally published. Copying and pasting the entire story will not let the publishers and other decision makers know what is being read and passed along. They need to see the number of online views and clicks to the original article to measure its reach. Share links to gardening stories often on online social media, whether that be Facebook, Pinterest, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. Hit like every time you read an online article or blog post. Comment on garden articles. Even if you read the article in the print version, go to the publication's website, blog, or Facebook page and let them know you read it. Your comment can be as simple as, "Keep up the good work." Get passionate. When a neighbor at the annual block party compliments your zinnias, offer to share seeds with them and then tell them about the latest garden book you are reading. If a youngster within your sphere of influence shows the least interest in plants, take them under your wing. At your workplace, share your garden's fresh bounty and tell people how they can grow their own. Don't accept the "I don't have a green thumb" excuse. Veteran gardeners know that we've all killed many more plants on our way to gardening success than we care to admit. Share this article. Yes, you have my permission. in your garden club newsletters, community garden publications, public garden publications, master gardening group lists, etc. If you need a print version, just contact me at kathygents@gmail.com. What's new this week? Well, a lot more ice and snow in the garden, keeping me indoors, but that's letting me access a lot of gardening webinars, and I enjoyed the wonderful Greenscape Symposium that Kim Eierman was a part of on Friday, February 19th, hosted by Brookside Gardens. Coming up will be the Rooting DC several day virtual symposium, so extended from just one day in person to several days online. So I'm really looking forward to that. This week I also attended a wonderful talk through the Four Seasons Garden Club on growing witch hazels, and I've added, of course, a few more to my wish list, and I am looking forward to a couple more garden clubs meetings this upcoming week, specifically Silver Spring Garden Club on moss gardening. And also the Beltsville Garden Club is having their meeting on February 24th. That's a Wednesday evening, and you can access their information at beltsvillegardenclub.org. Elsewhere in my gardening world, I'm forcing bulbs and branches into bloom. My forsythia have just opened up indoors, and that's adding a cheery note to these dragging winter days. And I've also put out the February 2021 issue of Washington Gardener magazine featuring our garden photo contest winners, and we extended it this year from 17 winning photos to 21 because we had such a wonderful crop of entries and still had to leave out so many wonderful photos. But I encourage you to go to washingtongardener.blogspot.com and subscribe to the magazine and look at the current issue and flip through those wonderful photos. They're also going to be on display this summer from August 1st through 30th at Meadowlark Botanical Gardens. And I encourage you to come and see them in person because they're even more stunning than they are online. And also included in this issue are some stories about comfrey, a new hardy begonia, houseplants that thrive in low light, a wrap-up of our virtual seed swap day, what to do in the garden this month, a plant profile on Wintersweet, and Smithsonian's Botanical Illustrator is profiled. One of my favorite articles that I think you should check out in this issue is the big changes for the University of Maryland's Big M in the traffic circle on Campus Drive, and that's my alma mater. I'm a journalism graduate from the University of Maryland, so this is a story that's near and dear to my heart. I'm so looking forward to the Purple Line coming to the campus and excited about the Big M being preserved and just moved a little bit to the left of the current M. So check that out. And happy gardening. Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter by going to anchor.fm/Kathy-Gents/support. For as little as 99 cents a month, you can become a listener supporter and we'll give you a shout out in a future episode. Another way to support Garden DC is to go to WashingtonGardener.com and subscribe to Washington Gardener magazine. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.